A bright morning sun was rising over London, and the streets near Buckingham Palace were filling with people. Among them was a group of tourists who had flown in from different countries. Some carried cameras hanging from their necks, some held maps, and some had only one goal in mind: to see the famous royal guards. Everyone had seen pictures online. Men in red coats, tall black hats, standing as still as statues beside their powerful horses. For many, it was a dream to witness them in person. For others, it was simply an amusing sight they wanted to capture for social media. The air was filled with chatter. Parents held their children's hands tightly, guiding them toward the palace gates. Street vendors sold small flags and keychains with pictures of the guards. Everyone seemed excited, respectful, and full of curiosity. But in every crowd, there are always a few who think the rules do not apply to them. In this group, there were some tourists who believed the guards were just performers in a show. They thought of them as actors who would smile or react for their entertainment. As the group got closer to the guard's post, the sound of hooves echoed on the stone ground. The horses were magnificent, tall, strong, with shining coats and carefully polished leather saddles. The guards mounted on these animals looked even more imposing. Their posture was flawless, their eyes fixed forward, and their silence spoke of discipline. The scene was breathtaking, and many tourists lifted their cameras slowly, snapping pictures from a safe distance. Yet some whispered among themselves, laughing softly, planning to test the guards. One man in the group nudged his friend. "Watch this," he said with a grin. He pretended to march like a guard, mocking their stiff walk. His friends chuckled, and though some in the crowd gave him disapproving looks, he did not stop. Another young woman leaned against the rope barrier that kept the public from stepping too close. She stretched her arm forward, trying to touch one of the horses, her phone ready in the other hand for a selfie. The horse flicked its ear and moved slightly, but the guard remained motionless, trained to ignore distractions. Most of the tourists admired the guards with respect, whispering about their discipline and strength. But the small group of foolish tourists grew louder. Their laughter broke the respectful silence. Children who were holding small flags looked up nervously at their parents, sensing that something was wrong. An elderly couple, who had come from far away just to see the changing of the guard, shook their heads in disappointment at the behavior. The guards stood tall, their hands holding their reins firmly, their boots shining under the morning sun. They had been trained for moments like this. No matter how foolish or loud the tourists became, they would not laugh, smile, or break character. They were symbols of tradition, discipline, and the pride of their nation. But the horses were living beings. Unlike the guards, they could sense disrespect. Their ears twitched, their tails flicked, and their hooves shifted lightly on the stone ground. As the crowd grew, more tourists pushed forward. Phones were raised high, flashes went off, and the horses blinked against the sudden light. A few children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Everyone wanted their own piece of the moment. The atmosphere was buzzing with excitement, but also with tension. The foolish tourists began waving their hands in front of the horses' faces, making silly noises as though the animals were part of a circus. Their friends laughed louder, proud of the disturbance they were causing. One guard's horse snorted loudly, blowing air through its nose. The sound startled a group of children who quickly stepped back. Still, the foolish tourists took it as entertainment. They whispered to each other, daring one another to step even closer. "Take my picture right next to it," one man said, stepping over the barrier with a grin. The crowd gasped. Many shook their heads, knowing this was crossing the line. Respect for the rules was being ignored, and danger was only a step away. Yet in their foolishness, the tourists did not notice how the atmosphere had changed. The guards, still stoic, had shifted ever so slightly. Their eyes sharpened, though their faces remained expressionless. The horse's hooves tapped against the ground with greater strength, and one flicked its head sharply to the side. The disciplined silence of the guards, mixed with the restless energy of the animals, created an unspoken warning. The wise onlookers understood it immediately, but the reckless ones only laughed louder. Nearby, a father held his young daughter's hand and whispered, "This is not a game. Those horses are trained and powerful." His daughter nodded quietly, sensing the seriousness in his voice. At the same time, the foolish tourist ignored every sign. They thought they were being clever, but everyone else could see they were walking straight toward trouble. As the first part of this story unfolded, the crowd had learned something about human behavior. Most came with admiration and respect, happy to quietly take photographs and watch history with their own eyes. But a handful of reckless people had already shifted the mood from excitement to discomfort. Their foolishness was not only disrespectful but dangerous. The guards and their horses were not toys, nor were they actors in a street show. They represented centuries of tradition, discipline, and national pride, and so the stage was set. The crowd waited to see what would happen next. Would the tourists finally realize their mistake and step back, or would they push further, crossing the invisible line that no one should ever cross? The morning sun was rising higher, casting long shadows on the ground, and the guards' silence seemed louder than the laughter of the reckless few. The first chapter of this event had made one thing clear. Respect is easy to give, but once it is ignored, consequences are never far behind. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace grew thicker as the morning went on. Visitors from different countries gathered around the rope barriers, trying to get the best view of the royal guards and their horses. The red coats and tall black hats of the guards gleamed under the bright sun, and the horses looked majestic as they stood proudly on the stone ground. Tourists snapped pictures, waved flags, and whispered in awe. Most people were respectful, understanding that this was not just a tourist attraction but a tradition with deep history. Yet a few in the crowd had other plans. They wanted entertainment, and they believed they could get it by making fun of the guards and their horses. At first, it started with small actions. A man leaned too far over the barrier, holding out his phone to get a close picture of a horse's face. The horse blinked and shifted slightly, and the man laughed as though it was a joke. His friend clapped him on the back and encouraged him to try more. Soon, two more joined in, waving their hands in front of another horse's eyes, testing how close they could get before the animal moved. Their voices grew louder, disturbing the calm atmosphere. Nearby families noticed and frowned. Parents pulled their children back, worried about the restless behavior. An older woman whispered to her husband that this was disrespectful and dangerous. But the group of foolish tourists seemed not to care. They wanted a reaction, either from the horses or the guards. They had seen videos online of people trying to make the guards laugh or break character, and they thought it would be amusing to copy it. They did not realize that the guards and their horses were not there to entertain. They were on duty. The guards remained still, their eyes forward, hands gripping the reins. They had been trained to ignore distractions. But the horses were not made of stone. One snorted sharply, its breath shooting out in a quick burst. The sound startled some children, who clutched their parents' arms. The foolish tourists only chuckled, proud that their actions had caused a reaction. One even said loudly, "Look, I made it move," as though it was an accomplishment. As the group continued, the mood in the crowd shifted. The respectful silence that usually filled the area turned into nervous whispers. People began watching the foolish tourists instead of the guards. Some shook their heads, others pulled out their phones to record what was happening, expecting something to go wrong. The tension grew with every second. A woman from the group decided to take things further. She held her phone up for a selfie, stepping as close to the rope as possible. With her other hand, she reached out toward the horse's bridle. The horse flinched, flicking its ear back. The woman laughed nervously but did not stop. Her friend shouted, "Closer, closer. Get the horse in the picture!" She leaned in more, her hand almost brushing against the animal's reins. The crowd gasped softly, waiting for something to happen. The guard still stood in silence, but one finally moved his head slightly, looking straight at the group. His face was firm, his jaw tight. A strong voice rang out, "Stand back from the horse!" The command was deep and powerful, echoing across the courtyard. The woman jumped, startled, and quickly pulled her hand away. For a moment, it seemed like she would step back in embarrassment, but her friends cheered and laughed, treating the warning as part of the show. The foolish tourists whispered to one another, daring each other to go further. They ignored the stares from the rest of the crowd. They believed they had gotten away with it because the guards would not break formation. What they did not understand was that the guards' duty was to protect the animals in the area. The warning had not been a joke, it was a serious instruction. The horses grew more restless. One stamped its hoof against the ground, the sharp sound echoing like a hammer against stone. Another shook its head suddenly, the reins clinking loudly. A child in the front row began to cry, frightened by the noise. His mother quickly picked him up and stepped back into the safety of the crowd. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though something was about to snap. Still, the foolish tourists did not learn. One man leaned over the barrier again, making silly faces at a horse as though it were a playful pet. He opened his mouth wide, imitating the neigh of a horse, while his friends laughed and filmed the scene on their phones. The horse stared at him, its ears pinned back in irritation. Anyone who knew animals could see that it was a warning sign, but the man thought it was funny. He had no idea he was seconds away from regretting his actions. Around them, the rest of the tourists shifted uncomfortably. Some spoke up softly, telling the group to stop. Others turned their backs, unwilling to watch what seemed like foolishness about to turn into danger. The guards' patience was clear, but their silence carried weight. Every step the reckless tourist took closer to the horses was another step closer to consequences. The tension in the air could be felt like a tight string ready to snap. The horses' breathing grew louder, their strong bodies shifting with unease. The crowd was divided, half in awe of the discipline of the guards, half in worry for what the foolish tourists might cause. The palace grounds, usually a place of admiration and tradition, had turned into a stage where disrespect clashed with duty. As this second part of the story unfolded, one truth became clear. While most visitors respected the moment, a few careless ones could change everything. Their laughter was loud, but it was not joyful. It was careless, thoughtless, and dangerous. And soon their actions would bring a response that no one in the crowd would forget. The foolish group still believed they were in control, still believed they were simply playing. But the horses were not toys, and the guards were not actors. Every sound of restless hooves and every sharp breath from the animals was a warning. A lesson was about to be taught, not with words, but with the instant regret that comes when people push too far. The crowd outside the palace was no longer relaxed. The respectful tourists stood quietly, holding their cameras lower now, whispering to each other about what they had just seen. Everyone felt the change in the air. The foolish group had already ignored warnings, and now the royal guards were fully alert, their voices ready to cut through the noise if needed. The tourists who had acted recklessly were still laughing, but their laughter sounded forced, almost shaky, as if they knew deep inside that they had gone too far. The horses were no longer still. They had begun shifting their weight from one hoof to another. Their tails flicked sharply and their ears moved back and forth, scanning every sound. One of the horses let out a loud snort, its breath puffing in the air like smoke. Another stamped its hoof again, harder this time, sending a loud crack across the stone ground. The crowd gasped, many stepping back. Parents pulled their children even farther away, realizing that the animals were showing signs of agitation. Then it happened. A guard moved his head slightly and gave another warning in a firm, commanding voice. "Stand back at once." His words carried power, echoing across the open courtyard. This time, the tourists who had been misbehaving froze for a moment. Some of them looked at each other nervously. They had not expected such a strong response. For a brief second, it seemed they might finally back away. But foolishness is often mixed with pride. One man from the group shrugged and said loudly, "What's the big deal? They're just horses." His words carried across the crowd, and people gasped again, not at the guards or the horses this time, but at the disrespect in his voice. An elderly visitor shook his head in disbelief. "Just horses?" he muttered. "These are part of the royal guard." The man's wife nodded, whispering that this young tourist had no idea what he was dealing with. The horses, sensitive to sound and movement, grew even more unsettled. One turned its head quickly, the reins jingling loudly. The sudden movement caused the reckless man to step back, his confidence fading for the first time. The laughter in his group began to break apart. Some of them giggled nervously, while others lowered their phones, realizing that this was no longer funny. The respectful crowd stood still, waiting to see what would happen next. Some whispered to their families about the importance of discipline, explaining that the guards were not actors, but real protectors of tradition. A little boy asked his father why the horses were so upset, and his father explained gently, "Because they can feel when people are not respecting them. Animals know these things better than we do." Meanwhile, the guards remained calm but firm. Their silence was heavy, like an invisible wall between the disciplined and the disrespectful. The foolish group shifted uneasily. They were no longer as bold as before, but none of them wanted to be the first to admit they were wrong. Pride held them in place even as the atmosphere grew more tense. One horse tossed its head suddenly, letting out a loud neigh that startled the front row of tourists. A woman gasped and nearly dropped her camera. A child began to cry softly, his mother whispering calming words as she quickly moved back. The noise was not random. It was a clear sign that the animals had had enough. The guards' eyes were sharp now, scanning the crowd, ready to act if the line was crossed again. They did not raise their weapons or move from their position, but their voices were steady and clear. "Keep your distance," one shouted. The words left no room for argument. Even the foolish group could no longer pretend this was a game. For the first time, the group of tourists began to feel the weight of their actions. The horses were no longer amusing. They were powerful, unpredictable creatures who demanded respect. The guards were not statues. They were professionals trained to act if necessary. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were watching with serious, even disappointed faces. The foolish group had lost the audience they had tried so hard to impress. One of the tourists in the group finally lowered his phone and whispered to his friends, "Maybe we should stop." His voice was shaky, filled with nervousness. Another nodded reluctantly, glancing at the horse that had stomped so hard only moments before. The woman who had nearly touched the reins earlier pulled her hand back completely and looked down at the ground, embarrassed. Their arrogance was beginning to fade, replaced by the first feelings of regret. Still, the lesson was not yet complete. The guards did not smile or relax, and the horses remained restless. The foolish group had created tension, and now they had to face it fully. The crowd around them was silent, waiting to see if they would finally respect the rules or make another mistake. This part of the story showed the turning point. The foolish tourists had crossed the line, ignored warnings, and now the consequences were close. They had wanted laughter and entertainment, but instead they had created fear and discomfort. The guards had shown discipline, the horses had shown warning signs, and the respectful crowd had shown disapproval. In that moment, the foolish group realized that the game they thought they were playing was over. The royal guards were not performers, and their horses were not props for pictures. They were symbols of a nation's pride, discipline, and history. To disrespect them was not just rude, it was dangerous. The crowd held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The atmosphere was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of hooves striking the ground and the sharp breathing of the horses. The lesson was clear. When warnings are ignored, consequences cannot be far behind. And the foolish tourists, though still standing, were finally beginning to understand that their actions had led them to the edge of regret. The palace courtyard was heavy with silence. The respectful tourists held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Everyone could see the guards were tense, their horses restless. The foolish tourists who had laughed so confidently earlier now stood uneasy, their faces showing a mix of nervousness and pride. They had ignored every warning, and now the moment of truth was approaching fast. One of the horses stomped its hoof hard against the stone ground, the sound echoing like a drum. The noise startled the crowd and many people jumped back. The horse shook its head, the leather reins clinking loudly, and let out a deep, sharp neigh. The sound was powerful, cutting through the still air. The foolish tourists froze. Suddenly, the animals did not seem like decorations for a picture. They seemed like strong, living beings that demanded respect. The guards remained firm, their eyes focused straight ahead, but everyone in the crowd could feel the shift. The warning signs were no longer gentle. The horses were no longer calm. The situation had reached its breaking point. The crowd whispered quietly. Parents told their children to step back, pulling them closer to the safety of the rear rows. Even the respectful tourists who had been taking pictures lowered their cameras. Everyone knew something was about to happen, and then it did. One foolish man leaned forward again as if testing fate one more time. He raised his hand toward the nearest horse, laughing weakly at his friends to prove he was not afraid. But the horse had had enough. With a sudden movement, it jerked its head forward, letting out a loud neigh right in front of him. The man jumped back so quickly that he nearly tripped over the barrier rope. His friends gasped, no longer laughing. Their faces turned pale, and the crowd around them gasped too. Another horse, sensing the energy, reared slightly, lifting its front hooves just enough to show its power. The sound of hooves striking the ground afterward echoed like thunder, shaking the air. The foolish group stumbled backward, panic flashing in their eyes. Phones slipped from their hands, clattering onto the stone ground. The laughter that had once been so loud was gone, replaced by nervous silence and heavy breathing. The guards finally moved in unison, their voices strong and commanding. "Clear the area at once!" The command rolled across the courtyard with authority, leaving no room for argument. The foolish group had no choice. They scrambled back over the barrier, their pride broken, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The crowd watched as they retreated, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others whispering about how reckless they had been. The regret on the foolish tourists' faces was clear. What had started as a game had ended in humiliation. They had wanted to impress each other, to gather funny videos for social media. But instead they had drawn the anger of animals stronger than they imagined, and the sharp warning of guards who tolerated no disrespect. The instant regret was carved into their expressions. Around them, the respectful tourists straightened again, some nodding quietly as if justice had been served. The children who had been frightened earlier were comforted by their parents, who reminded them that this was why rules existed, to keep everyone safe and to honor traditions. An elderly man in the crowd whispered, "They learned their lesson. You cannot treat these guards or their horses as toys." His wife nodded, agreeing that sometimes people only understand when they are faced with consequences. The horses, after their sudden reaction, slowly calmed again. Their tails flicked, their ears twitched, but they returned to standing tall and proud just as they had been before. Their discipline was clear, but so was their strength. The guards, too, settled back into their positions, their faces unreadable as if nothing had happened. They had done their duty. They had protected their post, their animals, and the respect of the tradition they stood for. The foolish tourists stood off to the side now, their laughter gone. They whispered among themselves, but their voices were low, filled with shame. The videos they had captured were no longer funny souvenirs. Instead, they were reminders of how foolish they had been in front of hundreds of witnesses. Their actions had embarrassed them, and the regret was something they would not forget soon. The rest of the crowd took in the moment with quiet reflection. Many felt proud of the guards' discipline and the horses' strength. Some even whispered that the tourist had gotten exactly what they deserved. Respect was not just a polite option here, it was required. The courtyard, the guards, and the horses were symbols of a nation's history and honor. To treat them as a joke was to invite trouble, and that trouble had arrived swiftly. The atmosphere slowly returned to normal, but the lesson lingered in the air. Parents explained to their children why they must always respect animals and people who serve their country. Travelers from far away shared stories about how traditions in their own countries also demanded respect. The event became more than just a morning visit to Buckingham Palace. It became a memory that would stay with every witness. The foolish group, still red-faced, finally walked away, blending into the larger crowd, but they could not escape the feeling of regret that followed them. Every step they took reminded them of the moment when their arrogance turned into fear, and when their laughter turned into silence. They had ignored warnings, mocked tradition, and treated living beings as toys. The horses had responded, the guards had acted, and the crowd had judged them. This part of the story showed the exact moment of instant regret. It was the turning point where pride met consequence and disrespect met discipline. The horses had spoken louder than any words, and the guards had enforced the rules with sharp commands. The foolish tourist had no choice but to face their mistake. The lesson was simple but powerful. Respect is not optional. When people ignore it, they do not just embarrass themselves. They endanger others and insult traditions that carry centuries of history. The regret of the foolish tourists was not just about being frightened. It was about realizing too late that they had disrespected something greater than themselves. As the sun continued to rise, shining over the palace walls, the courtyard seemed calm again. But for those who had witnessed what had happened, the memory was fresh. The sight of the horses rearing slightly, the sound of hooves striking stone, and the strong voices of the guards commanding order. It was an unforgettable reminder of why rules exist and why respect must always come first. The courtyard had finally calmed, yet the memory of what had just happened lingered in the air. The respectful tourists who had stayed silent throughout the chaos now exchanged quiet glances, their eyes still wide with surprise. Parents comforted their children, who had been frightened by the sudden movements of the horses. Some visitors whispered about how quickly things had changed, from laughter and disrespect to shock and regret in just a few moments. The guards stood tall again, their posture as perfect as before, their faces expressionless. They had returned to their duty as if nothing unusual had happened, but everyone knew they had taken control at the right moment. Their voices had commanded respect and their horses had reminded the crowd of their power. Even though the guards remained silent now, their authority filled the space. The foolish tourists who had caused all the trouble stood quietly near the edge of the courtyard. Their earlier confidence and laughter had disappeared completely. They were no longer joking, no longer daring each other to step closer. Instead, they looked down at the ground, embarrassed and regretful. Their actions had not only put themselves at risk, but had also disturbed the peaceful experience of hundreds of others who had come to enjoy the tradition. A young boy tugged on his father's sleeve and asked, "Why were they acting like that?" The father bent down and explained gently, "Some people forget that respect is important everywhere. They thought it was funny, but they didn't understand the seriousness of this place." The boy nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the guards who still stood proudly with their horses. Nearby, an elderly woman shook her head and whispered to her husband, "They will remember this day forever, but not for the reasons they wanted." Her husband agreed, adding, "And maybe others watching will learn from their mistake." The rest of the tourists seemed to carry a new sense of respect. Cameras were raised again, but now the pictures were taken quietly, without pushing too close or shouting for attention. The crowd moved more carefully, each step showing they had understood the lesson. The guards and their horses were not toys for amusement. They were symbols of discipline, history, and strength. The foolish group finally began to walk away, their heads low. No one laughed this time. They had come seeking entertainment, but they were leaving with regret. Their phones still carried videos of the moment, but those videos were no longer funny memories. They were reminders of how quickly pride can turn into embarrassment and how disrespect can lead to consequences. The atmosphere in the courtyard grew lighter as they left. Families began smiling again. Children pointed at the horses with admiration rather than fear, and tourists whispered about how lucky they were to have witnessed such discipline in action. The tension faded, replaced by a stronger sense of respect among those who remained. One man from the crowd who had been recording the entire time spoke softly to his friend. "I'm going to keep this video, but not to laugh at it. I want to show people how important it is to respect the guards." His friend nodded, agreeing that it was a powerful reminder. The palace itself seemed to stand taller, its grand walls shining under the sunlight, as if guarding its traditions with pride. The royal guards and their horses looked unshaken, their strength unbroken. It was as if the moment of chaos had never happened, but the people who had witnessed it knew better. They had seen what happens when respect is ignored, and they had felt the instant regret that followed. As the morning continued, the courtyard filled with new visitors. They stepped into a place where silence carried meaning, where discipline spoke louder than laughter, and where the power of animals and the duty of guards demanded quiet admiration. The earlier incident became a story whispered among them, passed from one visitor to another. "Did you see what happened?" Some tourists annoyed the horses and they instantly regretted it. The foolish group was gone, but their mistake had left behind a powerful lesson. Respect was not optional, it was essential. The guards had shown patience, the horses had shown strength, and the crowd had witnessed the truth. Those who treat tradition lightly end up carrying regret heavily. By the time the changing of the guard ceremony began, the atmosphere had completely changed. The music of the marching band filled the air. The guards moved with perfect precision, and the crowd clapped softly in admiration. It was as though the morning had reset, but the lesson remained in everyone's heart. The story ended not with the laughter of the foolish, but with the respect of the many. For those who had been there, the memory would always stay clear. The moment when careless tourists faced the power of discipline and the instant regret that reminded them and everyone else that some places and some traditions deserve nothing less than full respect.